decided partway through actually to use a systems lens or a systemic approach. So my topic is the priority accorded to health, wellbeing and equity in urban planning and urban renewal in Sydney, using the redevelopment of the Waterloo public housing estate as a case study. So very much a way of saying, okay, I've observed things shift from sort of a physical focus to a social focus and perhaps back to a physical focus. You know, what's going on amongst all of that? Where are we and what should we be doing when we renew public housing estates today? This is a quick sketch. I won't explain all of this, but basically just to say that what I'm talking about today is really the estate renewal strategy documents and how they reflect shift in how people are sort of perceived in policy and practice. I'm also doing a similar piece of analysis with metropolitan strategic plans for Sydney. So looking at them from 1948 to 2018 to see how they've shifted over time in how they talk about people and social outcomes. And a few other things, but I won't go into that. I'll get on with the main game. How am I doing it? As I said before, I'm using a systems approach, and really what I'm trying to look at when I look at different iterations of estate strategies is that purpose. So I'm not getting fixated on policy content, all the details, specific things that are being done. I'm trying to understand what their fundamental purpose is. So if you like, the sort of values that underpin them. So I love this quote from Russell Ackoff. The more efficient you are at doing the wrong thing, the wronger you become. It is much better to do the right thing wronger than the wrong thing righter. If you do the right thing wrong and correct it, you get better. So basically, we've got to start by doing the right thing and then figure out the details. And I think some of what we've done, and I'll get into this in detail, some of what we've done more recently is tried to do something really efficiently, but not necessarily focused on, is it the right thing itself? My systems lens is really about saying everything is interconnected. So I'm using Waterloo as a case study, and specifically the redevelopment of the estate under Communities Plus. But there are other things going on in Waterloo. There are other policies that have an impact on what happens in Waterloo. And I really can't understand, I don't want to sort of artificially separate out the redevelopment of the estate from everything else, from the bigger policy environment. I'm using an approach called critical systems heuristics, and essentially it looks at these 12 variables, uses these 12 variables to assess a system, whatever the system may be. So in my case, it's a project and a set of policies that relate to it. I'm going to walk through each of these and tell you what I found when I looked at the various iterations of strategies and tried to see how they dealt with each of these issues. The process, it's quite hard to actually get my hand on a couple of the old documents, but I managed in the end. Plugged them into NVivo, coded them according to those 12 variables on the previous slide, and then coded them in a second layer to see what I was finding for each of those variables. This is what I thought I would find. I thought that in the early days, community renewal, was just getting started, lots of mistakes, was a bit of a problem. Living communities came along, there was more money, there was an integrated approach. So I thought, that would be the high point, and then we'd sort of scale back again during Communities Plus. So I'll come back to this as we go. So what am I finding? When I looked through these documents to see who the intended beneficiaries of each of the different estate strategies was, in the first couple, it was clearly residents of estates. There was language around their disadvantage and how that should be addressed. Once you get to Communities Plus, the current strategy, the language is around economic benefits, benefits to Land and Housing Corporation, which gets renewed stock, benefits to the residents of Sydney, there'll be new housing supply in Waterloo, a lot of it private, and also residents of estates. I think it's really significant that the sort of focus has been dispersed over time. In terms of the purpose, which is quite similar, the first couple of strategies were all about wellbeing, as I said, addressing social exclusion, addressing disadvantage. Now the purpose is about community integration, housing supply, economic outcomes, pretty similar to the last slide. You can see, yeah, quite a shift. And so if we think back to that Russell Ackoff quote, on the left side there's clarity of purpose. And I think people were focused on what a human service agency should be focused on. Now it's a bit unclear what the focus is and what the core purpose is. When I looked at measures, none of them were great at being transparent about how their success would be measured. But the thing that I noticed really clearly was that early on, it was easier to measure. They did some pre and post surveys. So if we're going to upgrade your house, we'll survey you before, we'll survey you after. Do you like your house better? Do you like your neighbourhood better? Over time, what you might measure got a bit confused. In Bonnyrigg, there was an intention to measure client outcomes, but it got caught up in a contractual scheme, if you like. So you ended up with these 4 things being the key things that the consortium redeveloping Bonnyrigg would be measured on: communication, continuity of housing supply, housing quality, and standard of service. So none of those is actually well-being. None of those is actually particularly addressed disadvantage. Communities plus it's not explicit. So the way I sort of characterise that is to say the evaluability over time has decreased. It's become harder to know if you're doing what you wanted to do when you started. Asked who the key decision maker is. Early on, it was clearly the Department of Housing with tenants. There were neighbourhood advisory structures set up to work with the department on what it would do, how and when. In living communities, it got a bit messier. The Department of Housing really decided what would go into a PPP contract, but then it contracted out a project to a consortium, and really, as long as they met their contractual obligations, it was then up to the consortium what they did. So they kind of became a decision maker rather than government. And in Communities Plus, and I've looked at this a little bit differently, but there's a lot more senior government involvement, cabinet making decisions about where a metro station would go to enable a state redevelopment. Lots more ministerial intervention. So that's sort of the obvious thing there. There's also in systems thinking a desire to sort of look at what is and is not under the decision maker's control. And the thing that I sort of emphasised here is that in the early days, the department had a budget, it had staff, and it did what it could. It did the best it could with what it had. In living communities, it had a budget, it had assets that it could trade, so it could do a deal with the private sector, and then the private sector, to some extent, was under the control of the agency because it had a contract with them. But as I said, that I was involved in some of the delivery, and it got murky. Communities Plus, you're looking at really there is no budget. Projects have to be cost neutral or profit generating, so you only have control over your land and to some extent the consortium that you engage. What's outside housing authorities' control? I won't go into this too much. There are complaints within each of these strategies about the lack of funding. Apparently that was acceptable to do that. You sort of bemoan how much money you didn't have. But over time, again, there's been a shift. The main thing is that, what ends up to some extent outside the control of the agency is the operation of the private sector and the way they do things. Who's an expert's changed. There used to be a lot of internal people, a lot of social planning input. There was a lot of community input through different advisory structures, and a lot of partners were involved. Over time, that shrank to the point now where really the experts are the private sector. We say, we don't know how to do this. Put a proposal to us and we'll go from there. I think there's a bit of a loss of corporate memory, corporate knowledge, skills, etc. Expertise, which is quite similar, but really sort of what are the skills, what's the knowledge that's being used. Early days, it was all about collaboration. We want to form partnerships and relationships with people. You can see a bunch of other things there. Heading into living communities, a lot of it became, are we good contract managers? Can we write a good contract? There was less emphasis on how you do the core work. And then in Communities Plus, again, it's come back to the private sector and sort of technical skills. How different people try to guarantee projects is interesting. So in the early days, they tried to guarantee the success of projects by involving community. Over time, that shifted to, in living communities, they said, well, this approach will work because we've balanced the physical, the social, and the financial. And now they say, well, this project will work because it's gone to the market and we trust the market. Witnesses. So who sort of gets to have input into different components of the project? It's the same sort of thing. It's travelled from internal staff and tenants through to more in the private sector, and now it's high level government and the private sector, not a lot coming from the agency or partners. Running out of time a little bit, so I'll skim here. Basically, the level of influence that tenants and other stakeholders have had over time has dwindled from them being involved on the sort of IAP2 spectrum to now really just being informed or perhaps consulted. Worldviews have shifted from what I would call an equity worldview back in the day, where it was all about, public housing estates, public housing tenants are disadvantaged, we will give them extra, we will do what we need to do to support them. And now the rhetoric seems to have shifted to a sort of version of equality that's really, we treat you all equally, whether you're equal or not. So if you start at the bottom, you'll probably end up there. So in a nutshell, remember that bell curve? So I kind of feel like that didn't work. In the end, I found that community renewal and NIP had a social outcome as their focus, and that was supported by physical interventions and by budgets, financial arrangements. In living communities, there was an attempt to balance all three, and by Communities Plus, it was really financial at the top, with the others having a subordinate role. We'll kind of do what we can with social outcomes in the context of a focus on the finances. I might leave it there in the interest of time. What it might mean, the only thing that I was going to say there is that to re-emphasise that I don't think this is unique to the housing sector. I think this is what we see in the education. I think this is what we see in the arts. I think this is what we see all over the place. So my ambition from here really is to try now, for the rest of the PhD, to figure out what might be done, not just in a technical housing sense, but in terms of influencing government. Thank you.
Any questions for David?
Questions?
Yeah, we have like 5-10 minutes for discussion now. So.
Yeah, I've got a question. To what extent does the splitting of housing responsibility into two departments, assets and tenancy management, relate to this sort of process?
Yeah, interestingly, they were together when Communities Plus was formed. Mm-hmm. So in policy sense, that didn't really show up in my analysis. Where it has shown up is in my interviews with stakeholders around the Waterloo project, where a lot of people attribute what they perceive to be, a complete failure to connect the two. Mm-hmm. So we've got lots of people sort of on the record, in interviews, talking about lurching towards a focus on the physical, to the point where there are meetings and forums that I'm part of that are run by LAC that DCJ don't come to. And you'd think, if you were talking about the redevelopment of the Waterloo estate, you've got 2,000 tenants there, that you'd have the tenancy managers, DCJ, coming to the meetings, but they tend to have separate meetings. They tend to run their own show. I really can't work out yet the nature of the relationship, other than they don't seem to have one. So I think it's had a really big impact in practice. The projects feel like they're in two separate silos. Yeah.
Any other?
Thanks for the presentation, David. Can you comment around the sort of the ministerial and what, that involvement and, how we've arisen to the fact that it's politicians that seem to be key driving forces now, and they weren't. Is that just because the funding is tightly constrained, or why are they?
I think it's about the money. I also think it's about, we have all these super departments now. So you've got, what used to be 3 or 4 different departments all sitting under one chief executive or one secretary. And you've also got this kind of confluence of different policy aspirations. As I said in there, I think to use Waterloo as an example, the redevelopment of Waterloo has been on the cards for 15 years or more, and there's been various false starts. But the thing that tipped it over the line was putting a metro station there. And as I understand it, that came about because Premier Mike Baird decided that they wanted a justification to finally get this redevelopment underway, and directed that it would be there instead of being near Sydney Uni. So I think it's those sorts of things. You're trying to achieve, use different departments, different policy levers, and they all start to mesh into one another. So, that involves then the Transport Minister. There are multiple housing ministers, one for the tenancy management, one for the assets. They sit within the Department of Planning, so then you've got the planning. So you've got all these different people who all end up involved. And I don't know if anyone's seen the Sydney Morning Herald over the past few weeks and the stuff that's been reported about Waterloo. The ministers have disagreed with each other in public, in the media. So, it's just a mess. And when that happens, I won't say too much about this because I don't want to, I still have some friends who work within government that I don't want to call out. But it seems from what I've heard that a lot of those discussions, debates, decisions are made without some of the key people in the room. They get sidelined. You're talking multiple billions of dollars. You're talking the reputations of multiple ministers. They won't leave it to people like me who I had more of a voice in 1999 than I did when I left in 2013. And I'd gone up, a few rungs on the ladder. I was much more senior than when I started, and I had less voice. So I think it's a sort of corporatization. It's a whole bunch of things.
We can have last question. Anyone from online?
Yeah, look, sorry, it's Susan Thompson here. Great talk, David, and really, I've heard you talk about your work before. It's really interesting. I'm assuming Peter McHugh is looking at decision making and the involvement of the political in that decision makings and in government.
Yeah. Sorry, Susan, we missed the first part of your question. The sound wasn't working, so I only heard the last sentence about Peter McHugh.
Oh, well, I was just checking that you do know about him and his work. Given that you're both members of the cluster, I'm hoping actually to get Peter to talk about his work. It's just very interesting, someone who's worked in government a long time ago now, but just your reflections of how you have so much less power and influence as a professional in the current climate that you would have 10, 20 more years ago.
I think we missed Alistair's question as well. Thanks very much for that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, can I ask?
Okay.
Thanks, David, for a great presentation. I have heard in numerous meetings with where there have been black representatives present, the Bonnyrigg project used as a kind of, or spoken about as a kind of best practice, and used to reassure tenants who are going through a redevelopment process now that we have your interests at heart, and this is about you and improving your housing experience and your community and so on and so forth. Do you think that that's something that the kind of, I guess, to put it cynically, the kind of use of that legacy to legitimize what you're saying is quite a new form of development? Do you think that's coming as a directive from higher up in the departments or from the ministers, or is that just something that individual public servants might do to kind of reassure themselves that they're, doing something for the good of the people they're speaking to?
I think there's a couple of things that are going on when we talk about Bonnyrigg. One of the ways that I would now talk about Bonnyrigg is as a gateway drug. It felt at the time like everything was amazing because there was more money than there used to be to do this work. But in hindsight, and now having looked through a bunch of documents and having reflected, it feels like, they were the ones that opened the door to the private sector, to contracting things out, to relying on other people to do things that may or may not produce government's social objectives. So, if you look at it in that way, I think referring to Bonnyrigg's kind of like, I think that's a bit misleading. I mean, another thing about Bonnyrigg was that all the really good work on community engagement and support that went on was actually before the project got contracted out. So there was a team within what was then the Department of Housing that did an amazing job of engaging people, an amazing job of providing community activities and events and supports. When it got contracted out to the consortium, which has since gone bust, so that's yet another strike against Bonnyrigg, but when it got contracted out, a lot of that shrank. And I was involved in some of the contract management. And you could see that there was this massive shift in the community. They wondered where all of their activities and events and support had gone. And there wasn't really anything that we could do because they were ticking the right boxes in the PPP contract. So, I think holding up Bonnyrigg is probably a bit misleading or a bit dangerous. The thing that I need, quick footnote before I finish, the PPP in Bonnyrigg faltered and the project got taken back by government, and I haven't been involved since. So they may well be doing good things now that I haven't seen. But certainly from my point of view, Bonnyrigg was not the shining light that it's been billed as, at least not after it was handed over to the consortium.
Cool. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Thanks. The next speaker we have is Claire, and she is a HDR student as well. So she is going to talk about digital, like smart
digital planning.
Digital planning,
Yes.
support tools and digital planning.
Now for something completely different. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for coming. It's really exciting for me as a PhD student that this seminar series is happening, to hear from all of you over the next year about what you're doing. And I guess I'm really lucky that I get to be one of the first ones. So no pressure. So today I'm going to tell you all about characterizing the digital planning literature using a method called citation network analysis. And from the feedback that I've had from my supervisor, Chris, and the review panel that I have, is that this is still quite a novel technique, perhaps. So this is actually going to be quite a methodological presentation. I'm going to go into the detail of kind of how to perform this kind of analysis, so that when you meet it in whether your students are interested in doing it, or whether you start reading more and more papers that are using this approach, you'll have a bit of an understanding of how that's done and what's going on. That is the goal. So a little bit about me. I've been here a couple of years, so most people have probably met me. I'm a PhD student here. I'm an urban planner and a computer programmer. I've worked in local government and consulting, and I did a master's degree over at our good friends in the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at University College London. So, to get to the substance of the matter. So the computing power required for big data, and city analytics, smart cities, digital twins, all of these things that you hear about, is becoming ever more accessible as technology improves, as computers improve, as our download speeds improve. All of this technology is becoming much more accessible, and everyone's getting very excited about this. Planning is no exception, and whilst probably a little bit slower kind of to the party, there is now a new wave of digital planning initiatives that are starting to be undertaken in planning organizations around the world. Behind the scenes, however, seemingly unbeknownst to the wider world, scholars have actually been exploring the potential for computers to change the way that urban planning has been done for decades. They've been doing this since the middle of the 1980s and even before. And so together, these researchers form a field called planning support systems. And this was a coin that was termed in the mid-1980s by an American researcher called Britton Harris, and helped to be popularized by his close colleague, Michael Batty. Various definitions of planning support systems exist, but for our purposes today, it's easy to simply say that it is kind of geospatial software developed specifically for urban planning, and specifically seems to be the differentiation that we use there. And many of the projects that your fellow researchers here at UNSW are working on would kind of fall into this category of research. The biggest one would be kind of the RAISE valuation tool, which a large research group is working on currently. So hundreds, if not thousands of papers, journal, conference papers, book chapters, journal papers have been published in the field of planning support systems over these decades. And however, there's been a long acknowledged gap between all of this research that has been done in university labs and then what planners do in the quote unquote real world, what the software they're actually using in planning practice. So there's long been noted this huge gap between the two. And now, as we're going through this kind of next cycle of implementation of technology, it's really a good time to kind of take stock and reflect on the research that has already been done so that we can take that research forward and make sure none of the valuable lessons that have been learned are lost. So I've decided to approach this using a citation network analysis. So it's basically a bibliometric analysis technique. Is a robust method to provide kind of an overview of the structure of a research field. And it relies on the assumption that if one paper cites another, there is a relationship there. And you can kind of map all of these relationships into a mathematical network. And by measuring properties of this network, you'll reveal things about the structure of that research field. And we'll go into how that is done in a second. It is actually quite conceptually straightforward, but it is computationally intensive. So lots of matrices operations, lots of data required. However, as I mentioned, all of these things are becoming more accessible now. So these things will become more popular. And I will be going into methods, but even if you don't ever have to do one of these yourselves, some of these techniques are actually kind of lie behind how the fundamentals of journal metrics and rankings are calculated, and also how a lot of internet search functions work as well. So it's good to have kind of a general idea of these things. So as far as I can see, although some people have published kind of this type of bibliometric analysis in the field of smart cities, I haven't found one specifically for the field of planning support systems. Reviews of the field have kind of been traditionally provided in the introduction of this kind of biannual series of books that tend to get published, which is great, but it's more like an opinion piece from the key editors to be like, oh, this is what we've noticed over the past few years. It's not really a comprehensive kind of systematic review. You should still read these books though. I mean, particularly this one, because I wrote the first chapter. But yeah, so this field and the associated disciplines have been growing rapidly, and it's really time that we took a little bit more of a comprehensive view of it and a little bit of a stock take. So there are a certain number of steps It's quite straightforward. This is a standard set of steps you go through. There is an excellent book by Zhao and Strottman, which is freely available online. If you should ever, or if any of your students ever wish to do it, I would highly recommend that they read it. However, so going through these steps. Step 1, the delineation of the research field. So like most kind of systematic reviews, the way this tends to be done is that you pick a research database or a few research databases, you record exactly what your search term is, you download all of the information about those papers, and that becomes your set of documents to analyze. And you systematically apply the method and go through those. This one was done in a search planning support systems. I got the top 1,000 most cited papers from the Scopus database, the Scopus API, and used that as my starting point. So I've used the Scopus API. Now, an API is an application programming interface. It is something that I can use when I'm writing a computer program to automatically download this data. And it comes out in a huge chunk of text, and it's quite detailed. So this is just, for those of you who may not have used the Scopus API before, this is an idea of the kind of information that you can download. You can get the abstracts, the titles, what journals they're published in, when. You can also get extra information on each of the authors, and Scopus kind of keeps track of where that author is currently affiliated with, but also their past affiliation history. So you can see over time the different institutions that they've published from. So this is all very useful contextual information that you can also bring into your analysis. Step 2 is the construction of the network. Now this is quite simple. You get all of your papers down one side and down over the top into a massive table, this time 1,000 by 1,000, and you put a 1 whenever paper A cites paper B or C, and you get this vast matrix. And you can represent it as either that raw matrix or as like a network diagram, as you see on the left. You have a problem though, because this matrix is something called a sparse matrix. It mostly has nothing in it. Most of the matrix is just full of zeros. So you need to come up with ways to condense it in order to do any meaningful kind of statistics on it. And there are 2 measures which are commonly used. So there's a co-citation matrix. A co-citation matrix is measures the relationship between 2 papers by counting the number of times those 2 papers have been cited in another paper. So those 2 papers appear together in a reference list of another paper. The other way is the bibliographic coupling matrix. What that does is you get your 2 papers, you look at their reference lists, and you count the number of references that they have in common, and you use that instead as a measure of relatedness. Now, these 2 measures are slightly different. So you use your co-citation matrix for to identify groups of really influential papers that are important in defining kind of the past direction and fundamental structure of the field. But it's no good for more recent papers because no one's had a chance to cite them yet. So the results I'll show you today are using the bibliographic coupling matrix. So even if you have a new paper, based on the papers it's citing, you can establish pretty well the relationship between it and the rest of the literature that has been published in the field. Step 3 is your multivariate statistical analysis. So we've got these huge table with all of this data, 1,000 variables across the top. If you say that's the number of papers you've got, you really need to make any meaning of this, you want to be able to condense it down to a few underlying factors. So that's where you use a factor analysis. Lots of matrix mathematics, as far as I understand it, it's kind of like if you could somehow plot the 1,000 dimensions and then draw a straight line, kind of showing where the main correlations are, that's what these factors will be. And you can identify the main factors, and they will represent groups of highly connected papers. And then once you go look at the groups, as we will in a second, you can start to see that it delineates quite clearly some specific themes in the literature, different research groups, that kind of thing. The good thing about factor analysis is that a paper is scored on multiple factors, so it could score highly in more than one category, which is why factor analysis is preferred for citation network analysis. However, you can do your normal network clustering where you kind of, if you imagine just drawing lines between all your papers and kind of like just cutting them off where there are kind of those sparse connections. There are various mathematical ways of doing that. But then you obviously, one paper belongs to one cluster. So you don't get to see where those overlaps are, even where they do exist. However, another thing that's useful is with your network analysis is to measure various things, centrality. So measures of centrality will show how that paper is related to the rest of the network, its influence in the rest of the network. There's very simple measures like how many people have cited this paper. The more people have cited it, you can infer that it's a more important paper. But there's other kind of measures of centrality. So for instance, on the diagram on the left, you've got kind of a green dot there. And it's showing that this one is important because it's providing the link between this group and that group. So it has a special role to play within that network, within the literature. So you can start to mathematically determine and pick out some of these things. Interpretation of results and validation. Okay, so you can, from the data that you've got from the Scopus API, you can do some basic descriptive statistics on your whole data set. So for instance, this is showing the countries that those papers have been published, the institutions are, and in the field of planning support systems, you have the United States at the top there, and then the Netherlands, followed by the United Kingdom, China, and Australia overall. So clearly highly concentrated in a few countries, not at all a global thing. The number of papers that have been published in journals has been growing over time. You can start to map out, you can pick out the individual institutions, for instance, that the researchers that are publishing are coming from. So we have Utrecht University, University of Illinois, and so on and so forth. You can even start to pick out the most prolific authors. Now, in saying this, this data set is not complete. It is good. It's a good representation, but it's not complete. So that's a warning there. But so, for instance, these are the top 10 that came out from this data set. Varian Chris has come in second. Silver medal, very good. And you can start to see like the key role that these senior researchers play in shaping the field and kind of driving the research that gets published, and that they reflect very much those kind of the different countries that we saw as well will owe the numbers of papers published in those countries owe a lot to these kind of individual researchers. It's quite fascinating to have a look at. And again, that's just a count of papers by the journal that they've been published in. So useful, particularly for me as a PhD student going where am I trying to publish papers, that kind of thing. Doing this is just a very quick snapshot of where I should be looking to aim for. However, the more interesting thing, apart from just those descriptive statistics, is starting to look at those factors, looking at those groups of papers that have been identified in that multivariate statistical analysis. And when I colored, so this is just a raw citation network. And when I colored it by the factors, like the main factors for each paper, you can see already the differentiation in that network by the different factors. So for instance, The biggest factor is something that I've called applications. These are digital planning studies that are dealing with specific case studies, talking a lot about applications of software and policy making, usability reviews, how-tos, that kind of very applied kind of research. A lot of the work that Chris has done and UNSW has done falls into that cluster, that kind of factor, that cluster up there. And then as opposed to that one, not cluster number one on the slide is for the hardcore modelers. These are the people who are really interested in the mathematics of the modeling techniques and advancing the specific modeling techniques themselves, doing the cellular automata, for instance, or agent-based modeling that kind of differentiates that group of papers. Okay, so the two main factors are those kind of methodological, when you go into them, the methodological differences, and this is a qualitative analysis now. So I've identified the factors and I've looked at the papers, the abstracts, their titles, the actual content of the papers. And then you start to get a whole heap of factors that are more domain specific. And it's really interesting how clearly delineated these different domains are from the quantitative scores on the factors. So the biggest one there is land suitability analysis. These are researchers using multi-criteria analysis, looking at whether agricultural land protection, for instance, where is the most appropriate place to have land for environmental protection, those kind of land suitability questions. We then have a group which is clearly looking at social planning, public participation, GIS, things like urban recreation, things like getting children involved in the planning process using some of these tools. Another one, green and sustainable cities, talking a lot about climate change resilience and green infrastructure. And then another one that's talking a lot about water planning and using these tools to look at how you allocate water resources within a catchment. There seems to be a highly connected group of researchers interested in that. And so on and so forth as you go down. So that's good. And there are some, so I did that. The best way I think of characterizing factors is once you've kind of got those scores is to look at those group of papers and do a kind of qualitative analysis. You look at the abstracts and you can code the themes that are coming up in the text, or you can go into the papers themselves. But there are some other shortcuts that you can use to kind of characterize these groups. So you can do all your word frequency types of analysis, your n-grams, and you can look at all those other demographic statistics specifically for each cluster. So as I mentioned before, that kind of first case studies and really applied group of research, and you can see that's coming highly from like the Netherlands and Australia, whereas kind of the hardcore modelers, you suddenly have a lot of the papers are coming from China, for instance. So there's a differentiation there, the type of research that is being done, and the institutions that research is coming from. Some overlap, but you can start to see these differentiation even just in the kind of demographic statistics. So upon reflection, this doesn't replace a traditional literature review. None of these statistics that I've done will actually tell me whether or not a particular piece of research was any good, ultimately. But it does provide a good shortcut to kind of that overall picture and to kind of get familiar with the key players. And that is usually takes a lot more. If you're just doing a traditional literature review, you don't usually get that till you're right at the end or even a few years kind of into researching in that field. There are a lot of different statistics that you can calculate, and it's just a challenge kind of conceptually to try to consolidate that into a meaningful story or something useful for other people. It is obvious that the planning support system research is highly concentrated in a few key countries, and kind of those superstar researchers that we had on the slides really have an important role to play in the field. And it was fascinating to see those kind of domain specific applications coming out. So clearly those different groups focusing their the application of these different kind of pieces of software to different types of planning problems. And as the field has matured, it's a useful stock take on everything that is being done. And perhaps this type of analysis can provide a map from which others, and perhaps even those outside the field or those outside the academy, can use to kind of navigate the scholarly work that has been done before. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, that was really good. Something like which we do whenever we do literature analysis anyway. It's like we do not consciously, but this kind of formalizes like all the stuff we actually think about. Keeping in time, I'll give preference to online questions first. So anybody have questions, discussion? Okay, so now we can go to offline.
I have a practical question. How does this deal with, does this only pick up papers that have like the hyperlinked citations and things in them, or will it actually pick up, data out of older papers?
Yeah, so the answer is the Scopus database is really only good from the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Anything before that, it's not so useful, which is a shame in this circumstance. So the paper is going to be titled like the last 2 decades of research and planning support systems kind of thing. Yeah.
Hazel says this is awesome work. There's a question from my side. So basically, like, I've done like I'm into a lot of network analysis stuff, right? So the one thing which I would be very interested in is like finding out gaps in the field. So for example, if from this, like, can you find out like, so this is the area which everybody researches, and there is like a gap here or something like so. What do you think? Is that possible?
I mean, it's the descriptive statistics of what is there. And then I guess you'd have to infer from your own knowledge or something else. If you're particularly interested in using software to do, as we are at UNSW, housing valuation, and it turns out that there isn't a cluster associated with housing valuation, then I guess that's a gap. Yeah. I don't know if there's any other way of specifically pointing out gaps without having a map of something that doesn't have gaps to compare it with. Yep. Yes, Chris.
I was just wondering, maybe you could say a couple of things about how you intend on using this in the next step, the PhD.
So I guess my interest so my wider PhD is looking at how technology and how data analytics is used in policy making, noting that I guess a lot of the research that has been done in the academic world hasn't been transferred. So I suppose having this there as a kind of comprehensive view of what can be done, what could be done, and then right now what I'm doing is looking at what's happening in the real world. It will be a really interesting kind of comparison, so I'll be able to see the gaps between the real world and the academic world, or the differences in the focus there. Yeah.
Cool. I think, is there any other questions online? Hazel.
Yeah, just a kind of practical question. If you're working in a field where there's multiple terms used to describe the same thing, is it easy enough to combine those into one search?
Yes, you can search on multiple terms. You use, like you would when you do it manually on the website into a database. You use those search strings, those kind of formalized plus where you put your quotes in and you put the little plus sign in. The computer program that I wrote uses that string. So that string is in the computer program, but it's the same string that you would type in. Sorry, by string I mean set of words, characters. It's the same set of words that you type into that kind of form on your database website.
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. It's a really interesting work. And concluding, so so thank you very much for our speakers. And I think we had a really good 1 hour. And so I also want to thank Alessandra for helping us setting up this thing. So it was a challenge getting all this hybrid stuff up and running. We're still learning. And I apologize for the initial hiccups in terms of technology not working. We have recorded this, so I'll try to cut them up as 2 separate presentations and upload them as well. Then we find a space in the website.
Do we have an update on the next presentations, Bala?
Yes. So basically, so we have the next session planned for 9th of April. So we have 2 more HDR students who have signed up for talks. So it's Kummo and Josephine, both presenting us for us. And then the other one is the week after, because the 2nd April public holiday. So we have to do back to back. So that would be 16th April, and we'll have Professor Hallperson. He is going to present about his recent work. So we have sessions coming up, and more than that, the space which we are hosting the seminar series is the City Analytics Lab. And not sure if everybody has a chance to explore this. I joined last year, so this is first year we're trying to get used to the stuff here. So essentially, it's a really amazing space with a lot of hardware, software, everything put in. And so we're going to be hosting the Locate 21 conference. Wait, I need to share the screen. Okay. Cool. So we are going to be hosting the Locate 21 conference on the Sydney side of things for 30th and 31st. So we are planning to have some tours explaining showing what we have in the lab, so that encouraging people to use it more. And if you are in the campus, you can subscribe or come along for the tours. So that will be all from my side. Chris, if you have anything, closing words.
I guess just on that too, so that we have a live site in the building. So it's going to be the first sort of face-to-face event that we're hosting back in the faculty. I think there's about 30 or 40 industry partners or government agency people that have signed up for it. So if you're interested in spatial data, it's available. We have 10 free subscriptions for students. HDRs, so if anyone would like to go for free to the Locate 21 conference, so that it's 4 days, you don't have to actually go to all of it. 2 of it are online, 2 of them are face-to-face. Let me know, because we've got 10 free registrations. Send me an email.
Send you an email.
And yeah, those tours. So if you haven't sort of had the full tour of the lab, that's open to everyone too. Within the faculty, and it also might be an opportunity to meet interact with some industry government people. So thanks, Bala. Thank you very much for organising this. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.
And special thanks to David and Claire for presenting.
Yes, and we're off to the White House.
Off to the White House. Sounds very official.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone online. We'll see you soon.
That's
have a good weekend.
Speaking of the wine.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's
Mind blowing, actually.
Yeah.
But you're applying a version of that, aren't you? If you're looking at the planning policy document.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I'm
So-
doing the same
Yeah.
analysis type of analysis. I like network analysis. It's fun.